You wake up in the morning, stare at the ceiling, and feel the weight of everything you need to do. Pay the rent, meet the deadline, follow the rules, respect the borders, trust the institutions, and at no point during the day do you stop to ask who invented all of this. Not because you are naive, but because the most efficient social conditioning is exactly the kind that never needs to announce itself. It's just there, like air, like gravity, as if it had always been this way and couldn't possibly be any different. But what if I told you that most of the forces controlling your life were invented? Not discovered, invented. The money in your pocket, the lines on the map, the laws you obey, the religion you inherited, the gender roles you learned before you could read, the race you were assigned, the status you chase without really knowing why. All of it is storytelling. Powerful narratives built over centuries that collective human behavior turned into reality simply by believing in them hard enough. Mass psychology doesn't need brute force when it has something far more powerful: consensus. And here's the point that changes everything. Understanding that something was constructed doesn't mean it is useless or that it should be torn down tomorrow. It means you finally have the choice to see it clearly, to consciously decide what's worth carrying and what was placed on your shoulders without your consent. Human nature has an extraordinary ability to normalize any belief system that gets repeated long enough. But it also has an equally extraordinary ability to wake up. And that's exactly what starts right now. Did you know that pink today, the ultimate symbol of femininity, was considered a masculine color in the early 20th century? Strong, bold, derived from red. And high heels, created by men, worn by men, a symbol of power and status in the European courts. The human behavior we call natural between men and women has far more to do with cultural narrative than with biology. Every society wrote its own script about what it means to be a man or a woman, and most of us memorized that script without even knowing it existed. Gender roles vary so dramatically across cultures that it becomes nearly impossible to argue they were universal. In southern India, matrilineal communities have organized inheritance and power through women for centuries. In Papua New Guinea, there are societies where men are the primary caregivers of children. This isn't the exception. It's the proof that social conditioning defines far more than nature ever could. What feels instinctive is almost always just very old. And what is old can be rewritten. Before governments, constitutions, or organized armies existed, there was collective belief. Religion was the first great system of societal control, capable of making strangers trust one another, people who had never met, speaking different languages, yet sharing the same rituals, the same fears and the same morality. It was this invisible force that allowed empires to be built, millions of people to be organized around a common purpose, and identities to be created that transcended families and tribes. Without collective belief, Rome wouldn't exist. Egypt wouldn't exist. Almost nothing we call civilization would exist. And this isn't just about faith in the supernatural, it's about mass psychology operating at a planetary scale. Religion was always, simultaneously, spirituality and social technology. It defined who you were, who you could marry, what you could eat, how you should treat your neighbor, and what happened after death. It was the code running underneath everything. Yuval Noah Harari explores this brilliantly in *Sapiens*, absolutely worth reading. Religion was never just belief. It was coordination. And coordination at sufficient scale is absolute power. Pick up a world map and look carefully at those lines separating countries. Now try to find them in the real world, in the mountains, in the rivers, in the sky. You won to find them. Borders don't exist in nature. They exist because groups of people, at some point in history, decided they did, and then sent soldiers to make sure everyone agreed. Patriotism, that almost visceral feeling of belonging to a piece of land, is one of the most sophisticated products of social conditioning ever created. You feel pride for being born in a place you didn't choose, under a flag you didn't design, for a story that was told to you before you were old enough to question it. National identity is modern tribalism in a more elegant uniform. Instead of face paint and rituals around a fire, we have anthems, national holidays, and soccer teams. Cultural conditioning transforms imaginary lines into something people are willing to kill and die for. And the curious thing is that the same mechanism of human nature that unites us within a nation is exactly what divides us from others. The US only exists because there is a them. It's worth asking who benefits when you believe in that division so deeply. Less than 200 years ago, it was perfectly legal in many parts of the world to own another human being as property. There were laws regulating it, courts defending it, and respectable people sleeping soundly, knowing they were well within the law. Today, that is unthinkable and criminal. If justice were something absolute and universal, how could it change so radically from century to century, from culture to culture? The truth that behavioral psychology reveals is that laws don't reflect an eternal morality. They reflect what the dominant group of each era managed to turn into consensus or into imposition. The legal system is one of the most ingenious constructions of human social structures. It converts power into authority and authority into voluntary obedience. You don't stop at a red light because you're afraid of getting arrested. You stop because you've internalized the rule to the point where it feels logical, natural, inevitable. That is societal control operating at its most refined level when we police ourselves. Foucault dedicated his life to understanding this mechanism, and discipline and punish is a deeply unsettling entry point into that world. Laws change, obedience remains. And that says far more about human nature than it does about justice. A lion has no rights. A rock has no rights. And as uncomfortable as it is to admit, a human being born in an isolated forest, with no contact with any society, has no rights. Either they have only strength, instinct, and luck. Human rights are one of the most noble and at the same time most fragile constructions that social structures have ever produced. They don't exist in nature the way gravity exists. They exist because a sufficiently large group of people decided at a specific moment in history that they should and then built institutions to protect them. Remove the collective protection and the rights evaporate. The historical evolution of human rights is, in itself, a map of the social conditioning of each era. Women had no right to vote. Black people had no right to freedom. Children worked in coal mines within the law. Every single advance was the result of people who challenged the prevailing belief system and insisted that a different story was possible. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 didn't discover eternal truths, it invented them. Deliberately, in the aftermath of the horror of World War II, and inventing something like that, at that scale and with that intention, may be the single most powerful act that mass psychology has ever produced. But what was built can be dismantled. A corporation has no body, feels no pain, doesn't de-age, and for all practical purposes never dies. Standard Oil was broken up in 1911, and its pieces became ExxonMobil, Chevron, and BP, companies that together generate more revenue than the GDP of most countries in the world. That is the power of the immortal entities that modern cognitive systems of law created. They accumulate influence, assets, and power across entire generations of human beings who come and go, while the entities themselves remain. The political psychology that allows a legal fiction to hold more practical rights than millions of real people is, at the very least, worth thinking about. And the most fascinating part is how these structures shape human behavior from the inside out. You don't consciously choose to be a consumer. You are carefully cultivated to become one. The most powerful corporations in history didn't just sell products, they sold identities, lifestyles, entire belief systems. Coca-Cola helped create the modern image of Santa Claus. Disney defined what childhood looks like for entire generations. The social conditioning driven by corporate economic power runs so deep that we end up mistaking brand preferences for actual personality. It is worth asking how many of your most personal choices were, in fact, carefully engineered by someone in a boardroom. If you had been born in Moscow in 1950, you would probably see capitalism as a sophisticated form of exploitation. If you had been born in Chicago that same year, communism would be synonymous with tyranny. Your deepest political convictions, the ones you defend passionately on social media, have far less to do with independent reasoning than with the address where you grew up, the school you attended, and the stories you heard before you were old enough to question them. Political social conditioning begins before you learn to read. By the time you finally learn to think for yourself, the frame has already been built. Capitalism and communism, conservatism and progressivism, all of these ideologies are belief systems that offer a complete narrative about how the world works and how it should work. And like every powerful narrative, they create identity, belonging, and inevitably, enemies. Cultural conditioning transforms ideology into tribe, and tribe into war, sometimes symbolic, sometimes literal. George Orwell understood this better than almost any other writer of the 20th century, and 1984 remains an uncomfortable mirror for every corner of the political spectrum. The question isn't which ideology is the right one. The question is, did you choose yours or was it chosen for you? Meritocracy is one of the most seductive stories that modern society has ever told itself. The idea that every person occupies exactly the place they deserve, that the rich are rich because they worked harder, and the poor are poor because they didn't try hard enough is comforting, because it distributes responsibility in a clean and organized way. The problem is that it conveniently ignores the fact that you don't choose the family you're born into, the neighborhood you grow up in, the school you attend, or the accent you develop. The social structures that determine class mobility were built long before you existed, and they are anything but neutral. The cult of status is a sophisticated form of societal control because it makes people compete within a system without ever questioning it. When the goal is to climb the hierarchy, earn more, have more, appear more, nobody stops to ask who designed the ladder or where it leads. Social validation has become the currency of the digital age, and the human behavior of seeking collective approval is exploited with surgical precision by algorithms that profit from your insecurity. Pierre Bourdieu spent his entire life mapping how social and cultural capital perpetuates class, and his book, Distinction, is essential reading for anyone who wants to see that machinery clearly. Real success begins the moment you stop playing someone else's game. At some point in history, someone drove a stake into the ground and said, "This is mine." And what determined whether that claim would be respected or ignored wasn't any law of nature. It was the number of people willing to defend that stake with organized violence. Private property, one of the most solid pillars of modern social structures, is fundamentally a collective agreement sustained by the institutional force of the state. Land that is worth fortunes today was, at some point in history, seized, redistributed, conquered, and reconquered by groups that simply had more power than those who came before. The deed at the registry office is the most recent chapter of a much longer and much less clean story. What's interesting is that property, as a social cognitive system, serves a real and valuable function. It creates stability, encourages care, and allows for long-term planning. Without some form of protection over possession, large-scale cooperation would be impossible. But there is an enormous difference between recognizing the utility of the system and believing it is natural or just by definition. The social conditioning around property runs so deep that questioning its limits feels almost immoral, as if land had always belonged to someone, as if property boundaries were laws of physics. Rousseau was one of the first to point out that the moment someone fenced off a piece of land and found people naive enough to believe him was the moment modern inequality was born. The $100 bill in your pocket is worth nothing. It is not gold, it is not silver, it is not food, it is not shelter. It's paper, or increasingly, not even that, just a number on a screen. What transforms that paper into real purchasing power is exclusively the collective belief that it has value. If tomorrow everyone woke up convinced that Bill was worthless, it would instantly become worthless. The global financial system, with its quadrillions in derivatives, credit and digital currency, is the largest structure of mass psychology ever built by humanity, and it operates with impressive precision as long as everyone keeps believing. Credit takes this cognitive system to an even more vertiginous level. It is imaginary money created on the promise of future money that doesn't yet exist. Banks lend values they don't have. Countries grow on debts that will never be repaid. And the concept of infinite growth on a finite planet is treated as economic law, rather than what it actually is, a very convenient story for those at the top of the pyramid. David Graeber, as Debt, the first 5,000 years, dismantles this narrative with devastating historical research. Money only works because everyone believes it does. And when that belief wavers, as it did in 1929, as it did in 2008, the entire world feels the ground disappear beneath its feet. From a biological standpoint, human race is a fiction. The human genome is 99.9. Identical across every single person on the planet. The genetic variation between two Africans of different ethnicities is frequently greater than the variation between an African and a European. The category of race as we know it today was not discovered by scientists. It was manufactured by colonizers who needed an intellectual and moral justification for what they were doing. Racial social conditioning was a deliberate project built over centuries to transform a superficial difference in pigmentation into hierarchy, into destiny, into unshakable identity. Few belief systems have produced so much concrete suffering from something so entirely arbitrary. And the most disturbing part is that a social construction can have absolutely real consequences. Colonialism redistributed wealth, land, and power so radically that its effects continue to structure modern society today in incarceration rates, income levels, access to education, and life expectancy. Racial cultural conditioning didn't disappear when formerly racist laws were repealed. It seeped into institutions, into algorithms, into the unconscious biases that behavioral psychology documents with growing precision. Ta-Nehisi Coates, in Between the World and Me, describes that weight with an honesty that simultaneously disturbs and illuminates. Race was invented, but what it destroyed and still destroys is completely real. We've reached the end of this journey, but the truth is, you're only at the beginning of the most important one you'll ever take. Because now you know that money is belief, that borders are agreements, that gender roles are cultural scripts, that race was manufactured, that rights depend on collective protection, and that corporations are immortal entities shaping your behavior in real time. You know that the social conditioning governing your life was built by others, in other times with other interests in mind. And knowing that changes everything because you can unsee what you've already seen. But knowledge without reflection is just information. So let me ask you a few questions that are worth far more than any answer I could give you. How many of your deepest beliefs did you actually choose, and how many were installed before you were old enough to question them? Which belief systems are you carrying, not because they make sense to you, but simply because they've always been that way? What stories about success, identity, belonging, and self-worth have you repeated so many times that you confuse them for truth? Behavioral psychology shows us that awareness is the first step and the hardest one. You took that step today. Human civilization is built on shared stories. Some of those stories elevated us, pulled us out of caves, taught us to cooperate at an impossible scale, gave us rights that previous generations died to secure. Others imprisoned us in ways we can barely name. The difference between someone who lives inside the matrix and someone who can see it isn't intelligence. Yes, a willingness to sit with discomfort. The most powerful forces in your life are invisible because everyone agrees to pretend they were real. Now you know that. The question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge? If this content stirred something in you, and I believe it did, then you already understand why this channel exists. Subscribe to The Human Professor, hit the notification bell, and come back every week to dismantle one more story that someone tried to sell you as absolute truth. The next video might be exactly the one that completes the puzzle.